Ethan Marlowe lived alone in a small cabin tucked away in the Montana wilderness. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was enough for him. Surrounded by tall pine trees and a clear view of the endless night sky, he found peace away from the chaos of the modern world. The silence of the forest was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the howl of distant wolves. But that night was different. The storm came without warning. It started with a low, deep rumble that seemed to shake the earth itself. Ethan stepped out onto his porch, his coffee mug in hand, and frowned as he looked up. The sky, which had been clear minutes ago, now churned with angry clouds. Lightning flashed, but it wasn't the usual bright white he was used to. It was blue, and it crackled in strange patterns that seemed too perfect to be natural. "What in the world?" Ethan muttered, setting his mug down. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was like a high-pitched hum, faint but growing louder. He scanned the horizon but couldn't see anything through the sheets of rain that had started to fall. Suddenly, the hum became a roar, followed by a brilliant flash that lit up the forest like daylight. Something crashed into the woods not far from his cabin. The ground trembled beneath his feet. Ethan's instincts kicked in, the same ones that had kept him alive in his younger years as a pilot and engineer. Grabbing his flashlight and an old hunting rifle, he set out toward the source of the impact. The rain made it hard to see, but as he pushed through the trees, he spotted smoke rising from a small clearing. When he got closer, his heart nearly stopped. There, lying on the ground, was a figure. At first, he thought it might be a person, but as he approached, he realized she wasn't human. She was humanoid, yes, but her skin had a faint otherworldly glow. Her eyes, even closed, shimmered like crystal, and her hair seemed to flow like liquid silver. She wore something that looked like a sleek, futuristic suit, but it was torn and burnt in places. Ethan stared, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. The alien woman stirred, her lips moving as she whispered something in a language he didn't understand. She struggled to sit up but collapsed again, clearly injured. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. Was she dangerous? Would helping her put him at risk? But as lightning crackled overhead and rain soaked them both, he knew he couldn't just leave her here. "Come on," he said, crouching down and carefully lifting her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, almost weightless. "Let's get you out of this storm." As he carried her back to the cabin, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this night was about to change his life forever. Ethan gently laid the alien woman on the couch in his small living room. Rain pounded against the windows as the storm raged on outside. He grabbed a blanket, carefully covering her glowing form. For a moment, he stood there, unsure of what to do next. "Who, or what, are you?" he muttered under his breath. Her eyes fluttered open, and Ethan froze. The light from her crystalline eyes was mesmerizing, like staring into the heart of a star. She winced as she tried to sit up, her voice weak, but carrying a strange melodic quality. "Shelter, please." Ethan blinked. She spoke English, though her accent was unlike anything he'd ever heard. He crouched beside her, speaking softly. "You're safe here. Just don't try to move yet. You're hurt." The woman nodded slightly, her glowing skin dimming as if she was exhausted. Her breathing was uneven, and her hands trembled as she reached for a small device strapped to her wrist. Ethan instinctively stopped her, his hand hovering over hers. "Hey, I don't know what that is, but let's not press random buttons." She stared at him, her expression a mix of fear and desperation. "I mean no harm," she said slowly, as if piecing the words together. "I offer anything. Help me, and I will repay." Ethan frowned, his mind racing. He didn't understand why an alien diplomat, if that's what she was, had ended up on his porch in the middle of nowhere. But her injuries were real, and her vulnerability struck a chord in him. She wasn't a threat, at least not right now. "You don't owe me anything," Ethan said firmly. "Let's just focus on getting you through the night." She tilted her head, clearly puzzled by his words. No exchange. Why? Because that's what decent people do, Ethan replied, standing up. Now stay still. I'll grab some supplies. He returned with his first aid kit, though he doubted it was equipped for patching up an alien. As he carefully cleaned a deep cut on her arm, she flinched but didn't pull away. Her skin felt warm, almost too warm, but not unpleasant. What's your name? Ethan asked, breaking the silence. Lyra, she said after a pause. Of Alorian Unity. Alorian Unity. Huh. Ethan smirked, shaking his head. Well, Lyra, you picked a hell of a planet to crash on. Lyra's lips curved into what might have been a faint smile, though it faded quickly. I was attacked. Enemies. Krek's Dominion. They followed me. Dangerous. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't fully understand what she was talking about, but it sounded bad. Very bad. We'll figure it out, he said. For now, you need to rest. Lyra nodded weakly, her shimmering eyes closing again. As Ethan sat back, watching the storm outside, a new thought hit him. If her enemies were dangerous enough to attack her ship, how long before they came looking for her here? Ethan couldn't sleep. The storm outside had finally started to ease, but his mind was racing. The strange woman, Lyra, was unlike anything he'd ever imagined. As she rested on his couch, her faintly glowing skin cast soft patterns on the walls. She looked peaceful now, but her earlier words echoed in his mind. Krek's Dominion. Dangerous. Sitting at his small kitchen table, Ethan nursed a mug of coffee and stared at the flickering oil lamp. What did I just get myself into? He muttered. Suddenly, a soft hum filled the air. Ethan's head snapped toward the living room, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting rifle he had leaned against the wall. Lyra's wrist device had activated, projecting a holographic image into the air. Ethan's eyes widened as he saw what looked like a star map, glowing points connected by lines that shimmered like constellations. Lyra stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She caught sight of Ethan standing there with his rifle, his face a mixture of awe and caution. It's information, she said weakly, gesturing toward the projection. Ethan lowered the rifle but didn't take his eyes off her. What kind of information? Lyra sat up slowly, wincing as she adjusted her position. Coordinates, safe routes, and warnings. She pointed to one glowing point on the map, which pulsed red. Here, this is where the Kreks found me. They are hunters. They destroy. If they come here. She stopped, her expression darkening. Ethan walked closer, studying the hologram. He didn't understand the symbols or patterns, but the urgency in her voice was clear. Why were they after you? What's so important? Lyra hesitated, then reached for a small round object attached to her belt. It looked like a smooth metal sphere, no larger than a baseball. She held it out to Ethan, her eyes locking with his. It contains knowledge. A weapon. If the Kreks take it, many worlds will fall. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't fully understand the stakes, but the way she spoke made it clear this wasn't just her problem. It was bigger than that. Bigger than anything he'd ever been part of. And now they'll come looking for it, he said, his voice low. Lyra nodded. Yes, they will come for me. For this. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, trying to think. He wasn't a soldier, and he wasn't a hero, but he couldn't just turn his back on her. All right, he said finally. We'll figure something out. But first, we need to make sure they can't find you. Can they track this thing? Lyra shook her head. Not easily. But they will. Scan. Search. Time is short. Ethan nodded, a determined look settling on his face. Then we need to prepare. If they're coming, they're in for a fight. As the storm clouds cleared outside, the cabin was quiet again. But both Ethan and Lyra knew the real storm was still on its way. The morning sun broke through the storm clouds, casting a soft golden light over the cabin. For a moment, Everything seemed calm, as if the chaos of the night before had been a dream. Ethan stepped outside, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. The forest smelled fresh, the rain having washed away the dust and pine needles. But Ethan knew better than to trust the calm. Inside, Lyra was sitting upright on the couch, her glowing skin dimmed but no longer flickering. She was recovering quickly, though her movements were still slow and deliberate. Ethan set a steaming cup of tea on the small table beside her. "Drink this," he said. "It's not alien medicine, but it'll help." Lyra took the cup, her crystalline eyes studying him. "Thank you," she said softly. She hesitated, then added, "You are unusual." Ethan smirked. "I get that a lot." Before Lyra could reply, the cabin trembled slightly, and a faint rhythmic hum echoed through the air. Ethan froze, his instincts kicking in. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, peering out through the curtains. "What is it?" Lyra asked, setting the cup down. "Something's coming," Ethan said, his voice tense. Through the trees, Ethan spotted movement, something sleek and metallic. It was shaped like a pod, hovering just above the ground, with strange, claw-like appendages on its sides. It moved slowly, scanning the area with a pulsating red light. Lyra's face paled. "Crexian scout pod," she whispered. "They are searching." Ethan cursed under his breath. "How do we stop it?" Lyra gestured toward the metallic sphere she had shown him earlier. "They track heat, energy. We must stay hidden, or destroy it." Ethan's mind raced. He wasn't a soldier, but he'd spent years working with machines and had a knack for improvisation. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a toolbox from under the sink. "I have an idea." He slipped out the back door, moving quietly through the trees. The pod was close now, its scanning light sweeping the area like a predator's gaze. Ethan's heart pounded as he crouched behind a large rock, pulling out a bundle of old wires and a small battery pack from his toolbox. He quickly rigged a makeshift decoy, using the battery to emit a burst of heat and energy. It wasn't elegant, but it didn't need to be. He set the device down and triggered it, then darted back toward the cabin. The pod's scanning light flickered and shifted, locking onto the decoy. With a shrill mechanical screech, it lunged toward the false signal, its clawed appendages smashing into the ground. Inside the cabin, Lyra watched through the window, her expression a mix of fear and awe. Moments later, Ethan burst through the door, breathing hard. "That'll distract it for a bit," he said. "But we're not safe yet." Lyra nodded. "They will send more." Ethan gripped his rifle tighter. "Then we'd better get ready." Ethan paced the small cabin, the tension in the air almost suffocating. Outside, the Crexian scout pod still loomed, its movements erratic, but focused on the decoy he had left in the woods. He knew the trick wouldn't last long. If Lyra was right, more were likely on their way. Lyra sat at the table, her breathing steadier now, though she still looked pale. Her glowing skin had dimmed, almost as if she were conserving energy. She watched Ethan with a mix of curiosity and urgency. "You think quickly," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Most would panic." Ethan stopped pacing and looked at her. "I've had my share of emergencies," he said. "But this? Alien hunters, scout pods, interstellar wars. This is a whole new level." Lyra managed a faint smile. "Humans adapt well. That is rare." Ethan sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Flattering, but that won't stop those things from tearing this place apart. We need a real plan." Lyra hesitated, then held up her wrist device. A small translucent screen projected from it, displaying a series of symbols and diagrams. "I can enhance your defenses," she said. "Your technology is primitive, but adaptable." "Primitive, huh?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "All right, let's see what we can do." Together, they went to work. Lyra, though weakened, guided Ethan with precise instructions. Using the limited tools and materials he had in his cabin, Ethan managed to create a makeshift energy disruptor. It wasn't elegant, and it definitely wasn't standard human tech, but it would emit a short-range pulse capable of disabling Crexian systems for a few minutes. As they worked, Ethan couldn't help but marvel at her knowledge. She explained concepts that were far beyond anything he'd ever encountered, yet she broke them down in a way that made them almost simple. He could see the respect in her eyes as he quickly grasped her ideas and turned them into reality. "You learned fast," Lyra said, her voice tinged with surprise. Ethan shrugged. "Give a human a problem, and we'll find a way to solve it. That's kind of our thing." By the time they finished, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. They set the energy disruptor near the cabin's perimeter, hidden among the trees. Lyra tapped a sequence into her wrist device. Activating the device, a faint hum filled the air. "It will work," she said with confidence. Ethan nodded, but his grip on his rifle tightened. "Let's hope so." As darkness fell, the forest came alive with eerie sounds. The Crexian pod returned, its red light sweeping across the trees. Suddenly, the disruptor activated, and the pod froze midair. Sparks erupted from its body as it collapsed to the ground in a heap of smoking metal. Ethan exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "One down," he said, "but I have a feeling this was the easy part." Lyra nodded solemnly. "They will not stop." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Neither will we." The night felt heavier than usual, thick with tension and the weight of what was yet to come. Ethan sat at the small table, cleaning his rifle and checking the ammo. His eyes occasionally flicked toward Lyra, who was seated by the window, her gaze fixed on the dark forest outside. Her mind, he suspected, was far away, probably on the enemies who were closing in on them. They had made it through the first encounter, but Ethan knew that wouldn't last. The Crexian scout pod was disabled, but Lyra's warning had been clear. The Crex would send more. They had already tracked her once. What would stop them from doing it again? Lyra stirred, her soft voice breaking the silence. "Humans, you are unlike any species I have encountered." She paused, her eyes searching his face. "You do not fear the unknown." Ethan lowered the rifle, turning to look at her. Her eyes were glowing faintly in the dim light, but there was something in them, something deeper, that made him pause. "We've had our share of dangers on Earth," he said quietly. "We adapt. We learn. But I'm no soldier, and this whole thing—" He shook his head, the words failing him. "It's way over my head." Lyra shifted in her seat, the glow from her skin lighting up the room. "You think we are different?" He raised an eyebrow, not quite following. "Aren't we?" "You are different," she replied, her voice steady. "The way you think, the way you act. You choose to help without asking for anything in return." Ethan looked at her, surprised by her words. "I didn't do it for you, or for some grand cause. I just didn't think I could leave you out there alone. That's all." Lyra studied him for a long moment, her face softening in a way that Ethan couldn't quite explain. "I do not understand your kind completely," she said, "but you are more than I thought." The words hung in the air between them. There was something about Lyra that Ethan hadn't been able to fully comprehend yet. She wasn't just an alien from another world. She was a being with her own thoughts, emotions, and a sense of honor. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself wanting to understand her more. They had spent hours working together, each of them contributing to the plan to survive. The quiet moments between them, like now, felt almost familiar. Ethan realized that, despite the vast distance between their worlds, they had found something in each other. Maybe it was an understanding, or maybe it was just the fact that they both wanted to make it through the night alive. Lyra broke the silence again. "The Crex Dominion. They do not believe in emotions. They see them as weakness." She looked down at her hands, her expression darkening. "But I see strength in you." Ethan wasn't sure how to respond. He wasn't used to hearing praise, especially from someone as otherworldly as Lyra. But he could feel it. Something was growing between them, a connection he couldn't ignore. "What's next?" he asked, forcing the focus back on their immediate survival. The conversation, however deep, wasn't enough to push aside the reality of the danger they were in. Lyra's eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of hope in them. "We fight. Together." Ethan nodded. Together. The bond they had formed, unexpected, impossible, and yet real, was something neither of them could explain. But in that moment, it felt like the only thing that could keep them both alive. Ethan stood at the window, his eyes scanning the darkened forest outside. He didn't need to see the Crexian forces to know they were coming. The stillness of the night was broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind. It felt like the calm before a storm, but this time, he was ready for it. Lyra sat across the room, her wrist device open, displaying a glowing map. She had been quiet for the past hour, her focus intense. Her earlier words still echoed in Ethan's mind. "We fight together." He wasn't sure how to fight an entire alien force, but if anyone could make it work, it was Lyra. He turned toward her, his voice low. "What exactly is it that you're carrying? You've mentioned a weapon before, but you never explained." Lyra didn't look up immediately. Her fingers moved gently over the map, adjusting something only she seemed to understand. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "It is not just a weapon. It is a blueprint, a design for something far worse than any weapon you've encountered on Earth. It is a power source capable of annihilating entire systems." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He stepped closer, his voice tense. "A power source. You're talking about something that could wipe out entire planets." Lyra nodded. "Yes. The Crex Dominion has been searching for it for centuries. If they use it, they could destroy countless worlds, not just in this galaxy, but in others as well." Ethan's mind reeled at the thought. The implications of what she was carrying, what she was hiding, were too much to process all at once. "And you're telling me you have this thing in your hands?" He couldn't quite believe it. "I do," Lyra said softly. Her voice had lost its usual steadiness, a flicker of fear creeping into her tone. "The Crex want it. They will stop at nothing to get it. If they have it, all life in this galaxy is at risk." Ethan took a step back, trying to wrap his mind around it. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something much bigger. The Crex weren't just attacking to conquer. They wanted total destruction. And the weapon, the blueprint, was the key. Lyra continued, her voice growing more resolute. "I am the only one who can prevent them from using it. That is why I cannot allow them to capture me. I will do whatever it takes to protect this knowledge." Ethan's eyes softened as he saw the determination in her face. She was carrying the weight of a galaxy on her shoulders, and yet she stood there, ready to fight. He didn't understand everything about her world, but one thing was clear. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone. He straightened up, feeling the gravity of the moment. "Then we'll stop them," he said, his voice steady. "You're not alone in this." Lyra met his gaze, her glowing eyes reflecting something deeper than the urgency of their mission. There was trust in her expression, a trust she hadn't shown before, and for the first time since meeting her, Ethan truly understood the weight of their shared bond. Together, they could face whatever came next. The night was closing in fast. The shadows in the forest grew longer as Ethan and Lyra prepared for what was coming. Lyra had explained that the Crex would not stop looking for her. Every moment they stayed in one place made them more vulnerable. They had to move. Fast. Ethan checked the weapons again, making sure everything was ready. His rifle was loaded, and his improvised energy disruptor was packed up, though he knew it wouldn't be enough to stop the Crex for long. He was no soldier, and this wasn't his fight. But in the short time he had known Lyra, he had come to realize that he couldn't leave her to face it alone. "We'll need to move before they get too close," Lyra said, her voice cool and determined. She had a plan, but it involved a risk. They needed to leave the cabin and head to a nearby Elorian outpost, one of the last places where she could safely contact her people. The only problem was, the Kreks knew she was here, and they had probably already picked up her trail. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked, tightening the straps on his backpack. "To the north," Lyra answered, pointing to the map on her wrist device. "There's a hidden outpost. The Kreks can't track me there. But it's a long way. We'll have to move quickly." Ethan nodded. He didn't need to hear more. He didn't have time to question the plan. As long as they stayed one step ahead of the enemy, they might survive. But if they didn't, he didn't want to think about that. They stepped outside, the cold night air biting at their skin. The forest was eerily quiet, except for the faint hum of Lyra's wrist device. Ethan took the lead, staying alert to every sound in the trees. They walked quickly but carefully, staying low to the ground to avoid detection. They had only gone a few miles when Ethan heard the unmistakable sound of something in the distance, the whirring hum of the Krexian scout pods. He stopped, motioning for Lyra to hide behind a large boulder. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the darkness. "They're here." Ethan's heart raced as he pressed his back to the rock. His mind worked quickly, thinking of a way to get them out of this. He could hear the pod's engines now, growing louder with every passing second. "They're getting closer," Lyra whispered, her voice tight. "We need to move." Ethan glanced at her and then at the trees around them. He needed to buy them some time. His eyes landed on a fallen tree just ahead, its thick trunk partially covered by moss. An idea formed. "We'll make a run for it. When they pass, we'll move toward the clearing," Ethan said quickly, his voice low. "Stay close. Don't make a sound." Lyra nodded, her eyes sharp with focus. The pods were close now. Ethan's pulse quickened. With a deep breath, he motioned for her to follow him. As they moved swiftly and silently through the trees, the Krexian pod's lights flashed in the distance. They were just yards away now. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he led them toward the clearing. They had to make it to the outpost, but they had to get through the hunt first. The night was thick with tension as Ethan and Lyra pushed through the trees. Every step felt like it could be their last. The Krexian pod's lights were cutting through the darkness, flashing like searchlights, and they were getting closer with each passing second. Ethan could hear the hum of the pod's engines, their sound growing louder as the machine slowly moved across the forest floor. He held his breath, knowing that the slightest noise could give them away. But they had no choice. They had to keep moving. Lyra's breathing was steady, but Ethan could see the faint flicker of fear in her eyes. She was trying to stay calm, but he knew that her mind was racing. The Kreks were relentless hunters, and the longer they stayed in one place, the more likely they were to be found. He motioned for her to follow him, and they moved quickly through the underbrush, ducking under branches and crawling low to the ground. The clearing was just ahead. They needed to get there before the pod turned their way. But as they neared the open space, a noise rang out. One of the branches snapped under Ethan's foot. His heart skipped a beat, and he cursed under his breath. The pod's lights flashed in their direction. "Run," Ethan hissed, his voice urgent. Without thinking, they sprinted toward the clearing, their footsteps muffled by the wet ground. Behind them, the pod's engines roared to life, the searchlight now sweeping through the trees. They were almost there. They broke into the clearing just as the pod's light fixed on them. Ethan felt the sharp sting of adrenaline as he looked over his shoulder. The pod was fast, and it wasn't going to let them go without a fight. "Keep going," he yelled to Lyra, who was just behind him. They ran faster, moving toward the rocky outcropping ahead. It was the only place that could offer them any cover. Ethan glanced back again, his eyes scanning for any way to shake the pod. But the enemy was relentless. Its light cut through the darkness like a blade, and its engines were closing in fast. Ethan's mind raced. He wasn't a soldier, but he had learned a few things over the years, especially about using his environment to his advantage. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, explosive device he had built earlier, something Lyra had helped him modify. It was their only hope. He handed it to Lyra. "Throw this when I say so." She nodded, her face grim, and he could see the trust in her eyes. They were both risking everything to survive this. As they neared the rocky outcropping, Ethan turned to face the pod. The light was now blinding, and he could hear the engines humming louder as the pod locked onto their position. "Now, Lyra," Ethan shouted. She threw the device with precision, and the explosive went off with a sharp crack, sending a blinding flash of light into the night. The pod's engines sputtered and whined, the searchlight flickering before shutting off completely. For a moment, everything went quiet. Then the pod crashed to the ground, its systems fried by the blast. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They had done it. They had stopped the pod. But they weren't safe yet. The Kreks would send more. Lyra stood beside him, her glowing eyes filled with determination. "You saved us," she said softly. "I did not expect this from a human." Ethan looked at her, his face serious. "Don't sell us short. We might not have the tech you do, but when it comes to survival, we're pretty good." Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile, the first one he'd seen in a while. "Perhaps there is more to humanity than I thought." Ethan gave her a tired grin. "You're just figuring that out." She nodded. "Perhaps I underestimated you, but now I see why you are the ones who will stand against the Kreks." Ethan looked ahead, his resolve hardening. The fight was far from over. But he knew one thing. Together, they stood a chance. The first light of dawn broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest. Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing, his rifle slung over his shoulder. His muscles ached from the chase, and his mind raced with the possibilities of what lay ahead. The Krexian pods were disabled, but that wouldn't stop them. They were just the beginning. Lyra stood beside him, her expression calm but focused. She had become more than just a stranger in need of help. In the past few days, they had fought together, learned from each other, and built a bond that neither of them could have predicted. The danger was still very real, but something had changed. "We're almost there," Lyra said, looking at the map on her wrist device. The Aelorian outpost wasn't far now, hidden deep in the mountains where the Kreks would never think to look. Ethan nodded. "Then let's move before they send reinforcements." They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds around them, the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant call of birds. The forest, once an enemy, now felt like a strange ally. It had hidden them long enough to make it this far. But Ethan knew the Kreks wouldn't stop until they found Lyra and took the weapon from her. Time was running out. After a few hours of steady walking, they'd reached a narrow path leading up into the mountains. The air was thinner here, and the climb was steeper. But Ethan didn't mind. He focused on putting one foot in front of the other, his thoughts sharp and clear. "We're close," Lyra said, glancing over at him. Ethan felt the weight of her words. Close to what? Safety. A battle he wasn't prepared for. He didn't know, but he was determined to see this through. He promised Lyra they would fight together, and that was a promise he wasn't going to break. As they neared the summit, they came upon a hidden entrance in the rock face. Lyra moved with purpose, her hands quickly entering a code into a small panel built into the stone. A low hum filled the air as the entrance slowly opened, revealing a narrow tunnel leading down into the mountain. "This is it," Lyra said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "The Aelorian outpost." Ethan followed her inside, the door closing behind them with a soft thud. The tunnel was dimly lit, but the walls were lined with strange, glowing symbols that flickered like stars. It was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen, both beautiful and unsettling. They walked deeper into the tunnel, and soon they reached a chamber that was far larger than Ethan expected. Inside were several Aelorian beings, each one tall and lithe, with shimmering skin and eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. They were watching the entrance as if they had been expecting Lyra. One of them stepped forward. "Lyra." The voice was calm, but there was a hint of concern. "You've returned, and you've brought a human." Lyra nodded, her expression serious. "Ethan is an ally. He helped me. He deserves to know what's at stake." The Elorian regarded Ethan with a look of quiet curiosity. "You fought the Krex. You survived." Ethan stood tall, despite the exhaustion in his bones. "I'm just trying to survive. But I'm not going anywhere until this is finished." The Elorian nodded, and for the first time, Ethan saw a look of respect in their eyes. "Then welcome, human. You have proven yourself. Together, we will fight." Ethan looked at Lyra, the weight of what they had accomplished together sinking in. There was no turning back now. The battle against the Krex would be unlike anything they had faced. But for the first time since this all began, Ethan felt ready. As the Elorians began to prepare for what was to come, Ethan and Lyra exchanged a silent understanding. The future of the galaxy depended on them, and together they would face whatever came next. For humanity, and for Lyra, there was no turning back.